In this tutorial, we're going to talk about parenting and animating, and also changing the interpolation mode of your animated keyframes. We're going to touch a little bit on emissive materials and using empties, and finally a couple of ways to render out and assemble your animations into video files. So to start off with, we're going to use the Planet Earth model from a previous tutorial. And I'm going to just go into material preview mode here, so it's not going to look as authentic for a minute, and we're going to have the Earth and the Moon and the Sun kind of complete a really rough approximation of their orbits for a video. And so I can get rid of my light here, first of all, because it's not going to be our light source, the Sun is. But we have a little bit of housekeeping to do first. So first of all, we're going to talk about parenting. I have two objects here. I have the Earth object, and you can see if we zoom way in, it's just slightly smaller than the Clouds object. If you remember from the tutorial, that's how we made it. So whenever I parent one thing to another object, create a child-parent relationship between objects, I always think in my head the sentence, "Child, meet your parents." So I select the child object first. In this case, that's going to be the Earth, because in a solid viewport, the Clouds object is going to be much easier to select by default since it's mostly visible. So I'll select the Earth first, the child, then I'll select the parent object, the Clouds. You can see in my outliner, the second object is the active one. It's the lighter orange color. Then on the keyboard, I'll just press Control P, and it asks me what I want to set the parent to. I set it to object, and what that does is it organizes them in a hierarchy in my outliner. So I've got my cloud object, and underneath it I have my Earth object. So if I select this clouds object and move it around, the Earth object comes with it. They move as a pair. Any transforms that I apply to the cloud object also apply to the Earth object. All right, now we have a Moon object here, and we're going to create an animated orbit between the Moon and the Earth. Now, the Moon, we basically always have the same face of the Moon facing the Earth. So first of all, I'm going to kind of put myself in the position of the Earth here, and I'm going to rotate the Moon into position so that we have that right face facing. It's a little easy to recognize. That looks about right. So this pockmarked end is the end that's always facing the Earth. So I'm not actually going to have the Moon spin around its own axis, because it kind of doesn't do that in real life. So to start off with, I'm going to create a child-parent relationship between the Moon and the Earth. So select the Moon first, the child. Select the parent second, child, meet your parents. Control P and object. Okay, and now, once again, if I move just the Earth object around the clouds here, it's now going to move the Moon with it. So a really simplified version of kind of the mechanics here, I could just rotate the Earth in place. I could animate that rotation, and it would drag the Moon with it. So that's pretty cool. So let's do that really quickly. Now, for those of you who are going to be sticklers about this, I know that this is not accurate, that the Moon or the Earth will actually spin about 28 times for every time you know what, I'm not even going to attempt it on YouTube, but I know that the Moon actually takes about 28 days to go through its full cycle around the Earth, so we're not going to do that. Also, I only want a 10-second animation at 24 frames per second. So by default, Blender gives us a 250 frame timeline. That's about 10 frames longer than I want, since 24 frames per second times 10 seconds is 240. Now, if you ever find yourself in a situation where the math is a little beyond what you can just do quickly in your head, you can actually have Blender do the math for you. So I'm going to click in my end box here and just say 24 times 10. And that does the math for me, and it puts my end at 240. Okay, so I'm going to rotate the Earth here, and I'm going to animate that rotation. and the keyframe, the moon is going to rotate with it. So to begin with, I have my parent object here selected. I'm going to tap I on the keyboard, and that asks me to insert a keyframe, and I'm going to insert a rotation keyframe. You can see up here in my object transforms, that turns the rotation values all yellow. That means they have an active keyframe. Now if I move my timeline marker, you can see that they don't go back to their normal color, but they do turn green. That means that somewhere they have a keyframe value, but that I am not on the current timeline marker for that value. If I go back to where the keyframe actually is on frame 1, they turn yellow again. So I'm going to come over here all the way to frame 240, where I can just hit this little jump to endpoint button. And I'm going to rotate the Earth a few times. So let's say maybe over the course of this 10 seconds, maybe I want the Earth to rotate 2 times. So that'd be 360 times 2 is 720 degrees. So I'm going to RZ for the Z axis, 720, enter. And now that's rotated twice, but it's not going to stick unless I keyframe the ending here. So let's tap I again, and I'm going to keyframe the rotation once more, and you can see that that now changes these values all yellow. Did you notice, if you might want to rewind a little bit, the Z value was orange there for a minute? That's because it had changed. So now if I jump to the beginning point and hit play, you can see that we've actually animated here. Now we do have a little bit of a problem in that the Earth speeds up and slows down, or in other words, it eases in and eases out of its keyframes. And of course it doesn't do that in real life. If we were to accelerate or decelerate with us on it, we'd all be dead. So I need to change that. That's what's known as the interpolation mode between the keyframes. So I'm going to go over into my animation workspace here, and you can see down here I have something that looks a lot like the timeline I just left behind. It's still showing my keyframes, but it's a hierarchical view of those keyframes. This is the dope sheet, and so with these 2 keyframes selected down here for my object transforms, I just go to the key menu and I click on interpolation mode, and by default it's set to a Bezier interpolation. I'm just going to change it to linear. Now if I go back and I play this same animation, you can see that there's no speed up or slow down at the end. It just plays at a constant speed all the way through. It starts at full speed and it finishes at full speed. So that's great. That's kind of what I wanted. Now I do have some inaccuracies here, right? So basically what I need to do here is I need the Earth to spin a lot more rapidly than the moon orbits it. And that kind of means that I have to change the parent-child relationship here. So what I'm going to do to accomplish that is I'm going to clear the parenting from the I'm going to clear the parent off of the moon. In other words, it's not going to be a child anymore of the Earth, so I'm going to hit Alt-P to clear that, clear parent. You can see now that the Earth is still spinning, but the moon is not following along because the parenting has been cleared. So first of all, let's speed the Earth up so we can be a little more realistic about this. This still isn't going to be accurate, but it'll look a little better. So we end at 720 degrees. And I'm going to say, let's spin it about 5 times that fast. So 720 times 5, 3,600 degrees. Great. And I can actually just right click on this value here and replace a single keyframe, and that will update it for me. So now the Earth is going to spin quite quickly. But I liked the ease of being able to just kind of have the moon go around the Earth as I did. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place an object in there that the moon can still kind of have the same relationship with, and I'm going to click empty plane axes when I add my object. So now I have what's called an empty inside of the Earth, and you can't see it right now because it's a little too small. So let's just increase its size, and you can see it there. This won't render, it won't show, there's no visuals associated with it, but it's going to do exactly what I want because it basically just provides a data point that I can parent the moon to. So I'm going to call this Earth Empty, and then I'm going to select the moon, child, meet your parents, select the empty, Control P, and I'm going to set the parent to the object. Now what I can do, the reason I did that is I can select this empty and I can spin it much slower. So the Earth is spinning pretty quickly, but I can spin the moon more slowly by just keyframing the rotation on this empty. So let's go to the end here, and we'll stay with our old rotation, 720 degrees. Right click and insert a keyframe. Now you can see that the moon is following, but at a slower speed. So that's a little more accurate, even though the numbers aren't accurate. And once again, my moon is easing in and easing out. So I'm going to go back to my dope sheet and change the interpolation mode on that empty rotation to linear. Okay. And that's working reasonably well. All right, so let's deal with the sun now. So I've got a sun in here, and I've deleted my light, so I actually need a light source. If I look at a rendered view of this thing, you'll see just everything's as dark as it can be. So there's actually no material even on the sun. So let's go into our shading viewport here, and I'm going to add a new shader for the sun. And we'll just call it sun. I'm going to add an image texture, and I already have a sun map that I've loaded up previously, so I don't need to browse to it. And I'm going to plug that in actually to my emission color here. You can kind of see what that's doing. So I don't really want any gloss on this thing. It probably won't show up as high as I'm going to pump the emissions anyway. And let's look at a rendered view here and just kind of see how we're affecting the Earth. So not very well so far. I'm going to put the emission strength up maybe to about 50, and that looks actually pretty good. Let's try 75, or maybe even 100. There we go. I like that. Okay, now it's very yellow, which our sun is a yellow star, but I don't want my image to look that yellow. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my sun color information here, and I'm going to go into my color nodes, and I'm going to add a hue and saturation node and just take the saturation of that all the way down. So basically it's just emitting white light. At this point I'm not seeing any detail from the map anyway. I probably could just set this to an emission material without even using the sun, and just set it to straight white and have the same effect. So yeah, your mileage may vary, whatever you want to do, but either way. So I've got my sun set up now, and it's ready to act as part of the solar system here. So I basically can kind of just take the same approach with it. I can spin the sun and have the Earth spin as its child, or I could put an empty in the middle of it and spin that at a different rate. In this case, for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to take kind of the simple approach. So we'll select our Earth, and then we will select our sun, Control P, set the parent to the object. And I'm going to need to parent this empty as well, because otherwise the moment I animate the rotation of this sun, the moon's going to be left behind. Remember, the moon's actually parented to the empty, not the Earth. So I'm just going to rotate the sun one time, I think, through the course of this 10 seconds. So we'll tap I to insert a rotation keyframe. We'll jump to the endpoint, RZ360, enter, and tap I and insert another rotation keyframe. So that will now take the Earth with it, but not the Moon. And it's also easing in and easing out. So now let's select our empty, shift click to select the sun, child meet your parents, Control P, set it to the object, and now you can see that the whole system is moving along the way we'd more or less expect. But it's easing in and easing out. So I'll go back to my animation, and I have my empty and my sun objects here, so I'll just select all the keyframes for those, and you can see which ones don't have a linear interpolation mode because they don't have this green line connecting them. I'll just go to my key, interpolation mode, set it to linear, and now the whole thing just keeps running the way it should. Alright, so finally I am going to set up my camera to sort of follow this action here. So let's see how it looks. My first view of the camera is not bad. So what I need to do here probably is parent this camera to another object that orbits the sun. I could have the camera follow a track, but I feel like that's maybe a little outside the scope of what we need to accomplish here. So this empty is turning, so I'll show you what happens if I parent the camera to that. Control P, set it to object, and then hit play. You can see that the empty, or the camera, is basically orbiting exactly like the moon does. And you know, you might want that at some point, but that's not really what I want to happen. So Alt P, I'll clear the parent on my camera, and you can see that everything just kind of runs away. So in order to simplify this, I think what I'm going to do is create one more empty, Shift A, empty, and maybe I'll change the shape on this one. I'll make this one a cube, just so I can select them easily, and we'll call this camera tracking empty. And I'm going to take this empty, and I'm also going to parent it to the sun. But it doesn't have any of its own rotation. It's not spinning. So Control P, set it to the object. You can see that the empty now moves. So now I will select the camera, the child, and the parent, which is the new empty. Control P, parent to that object. Okay. Now if we look through the camera, you can see that we're still following the Earth, but we're not spinning with it. And we can see the moon coming in and out. That's because that second empty is orbiting the sun with everything else, but it is not spinning in and of itself, not spinning around its own axis. So that's almost where we want to be. But I want a little bit of camera movement, and also I'd kind of like to reframe this whole thing. So a parent drags its child along with it, but a child can move independently. So I'm going to rotate this camera in the Z-axis, rotate it in X a little, and just kind of frame things up a little bit differently. So that we have the sun a little more visible. Okay, and that's kind of nice. That'll be a nice view, but what I'm also going to do with this now is I'm going to move the camera a little bit during relative to everything else. So I'm on frame 1, I've rewound, I'm going to set a keyframe for the camera, and that's going to be my location and rotation, because I'm going to need both of those data points for my camera. And then we'll go to the end here, frame 240, and I want the camera to be in a little bit of a different location by then. So I'm just going to move over this way, rotate in Z. And by the way, I can translate or move along the camera's local axes by double tapping the axis on the keyboard. So that's actually, let's get a little fancy here. Let's change our angle. So RXX rotates in the camera's x-axis. Tap I and we'll keyframe our location and rotation there. So now we're going to start in this position, and as we move through our animation, we're kind of moving a little more dramatically through the scene. That's sort of nice. Okay, I think that's good. So I'm going to pause after we render this out, or after I start rendering this, so that I can show you how to assemble everything into a video clip. But first, here are the settings I would use to render. So we're rendering in cycles. We're using our GPU. Our output settings are full HD, and our frames are set to 240 frames per second. So I'm going to choose an output folder, and we'll just go over to my desktop, and maybe I'll make a new folder. We'll just call this Earth Frames. And we'll accept that folder destination, and we're going to render out a sequence of still images. PNGs are lossless, but probably not necessary for this. I'm just going to render out JPEGs, and then I will go to the render menu and click on render animation, and we'll see you in a little while. So we're back. We've finished rendering out the individual frames of our animation as JPEGs. So we have a folder with 240 JPEGs sitting on our desktop. And now it's time to show you how to assemble that image sequence into a video file. So what I'm going to do is go to File and click on New, and I'm just going to go to Video Editing. And you know, I forgot to save my work here, so we'll save as Earth Simple 2021 animated.blend. Now we'll go File, New, Video Editing, and that brings up a different sort of interface here. So what I'm going to do now is go down here to my Add menu, and I'm going to add an image sequence, and I'm going to navigate to the desktop, go into my Earth Frames, and tap A to select all. And then I'm going to add an image strip. And that image strip comes in. You can see it's not quite as long as my total timeline. That's because, again, we're dealing with the Blender default of 250 frames. So I'll change that to 240. And from here, it's just simply a matter of rendering it out again. I can scrub through my animation and see kind of what that looks like here. I can see that I had way too much glare in my compositor, but that's okay. That's not really the point of this exercise. So I'm going to specify an output folder. Again, we'll just go back to the desktop, and maybe we'll put this back in the Earth Frames folder and accept that destination. And this time, instead of an image sequence, well, first of all, you'll note I'm still at 24 frames per second. I'm still at 1920 by 1080. But instead of an image sequence, so instead of putting out still images like a PNG or a JPEG, I'm going to change this to FFmpeg video. And under encoding here, the default container is Matroska, but I'm going to change it to MPEG-4 so I get an MP4 file that is probably a little more playable by anybody who doesn't have, for instance, like the VLC player or something. By default, that's going to be more playable on most operating systems. And from here, I just go back to my render menu and click again on render animation. And that's going to render the whole thing out. Such as it is. And now on my desktop, I have within my Earth Frames, sorry, I know that's not popping up in a visible way, I have my animation here as a video file. I hope that's been helpful, and good luck with it.